Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host has morphed from Michael Baranowski, who you're used to hearing, to my brand new co-host, Jorden Dye. He hails from north of the border, joining us from the Canadian province of Alberta. He has a wealth of experience in the sustainability field to bring to the show. Be sure to check out his bio on our webpage to find out more about him. Welcome, Jorden. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thanks, Kimberly. It's great to be on the show.
It's summer. If you're like me, you'd rather be on the beach, but we're not taking a trip to the beach for this episode about sand, or the desert for that matter, even though sand might evoke romantic thoughts of Arabian Nights. Instead, we're headed to the concrete jungle. The United Nations Environment Program describes sand as the foundation for human construction. But not all sand is created equally, which is the sustainability problem we're going to discuss today. It probably doesn't come as a surprise that water is the most used resource on the planet. But how many would have guessed that sand is next? It's hard to envision, but we use so much sand every year that it's like building a 9-story wall around the planet. Removal, transport, and processing of sand cause a lot of issues, including contributing to carbon emissions, which expedites climate change, which in turn causes sea levels to rise, shrinks coastlines, which then require more sand to stop beach erosion. So all of this makes it really difficult to meet the world's demand for sand. So Jorden, could you have joined the show to discuss a more complex topic?
I think sand's a great example of why we call sustainability issues wicked problems. They're really complex. There is not an easy way to do it, and we need a solution quick because we're running into major challenges. I mean, from the screens that we're looking at each other through right now to sand mafias and disappearing islands, I think this is just an amazing topic to dive into. So I'm excited for it as the first episode for me.
And, not only disappearing sanding, but also appearing islands out of nowhere, which is also, I think, a really interesting aspect of this and where some of the sand goes to. And I'm not so sure that those are the best uses of our sand.
No, and I think we're going to get into today just how many ways we use sand across the modern world. I think people would be surprised. As you said, it invokes images of beaches or, sand pits in the backyard and not the foundation of our modern world.
And so when it comes to extraction, the problem is that we are extracting sand, all sorts of sand, way too fast. Faster than the planet can replenish the supply. We're basically borrowing into the future when we use more sand, or any resource for that matter, than nature can replace each year. It's like species extinction. It's the same sort of issue that we don't really think about, like, oh, well, there's a lot of sand out there. Why is this a problem? Well, the problem is that it's not being replaced fast enough, and we will run out of sand. And then what, right? So the important thing that we definitely need to point out here is there's a difference between construction sand and silica sand. And these are the two sands we're talking about here for where we're running into problems.
Yeah, and I think, especially when thinking about distinctions in sand, another is where we can get sand from. A big thing for me as I was looking into this is the distinction between active sand systems, so riverbeds, lakes, those kind of ecosystems, versus inactive sand systems such as deserts. And I think one of the sad parts of this problem is there's far significantly less environmental impact from the inactive sand systems, but we can't use that sand for the resources that we need. So we're forced into taking sand from environmental areas that have significant damage. And as you noted in the intro, actually can cause cascading problems that are reinforced by climate change themselves.
And so with construction sand, this sand is rougher sand, and this is used, it's perfect for making cement. And cement is the binder in concrete that holds together sand and rock. And so we use sand to make cement, to make concrete. And then we also use construction sand for mortar to make buildings, right? So we've got all of these construction uses for this type of sand. The most common sources of these are along riverbeds, sea floors, sea inlets. Some actually can be used from deserts, but it's about the location of the source that really matters the most. And most desert sand is actually way too fine for construction sand. And so as the second most in-demand resource behind water, it's not surprising that construction sand market was at 112 billion in the market for 2023, and it's expected to grow by 25% by 2030. So we're talking about a humongous industry here. The other side of this is the silica sand, which is also super important too in terms of construction. But that type of construction sand is for very specific, like need really high dense concrete that can withstand really high, like pressure and so forth, right? And so silica sand is used to make cement for this high performance concrete when structures need to be exceptionally like load bearing or chemical resistance, right? Because the oil industry uses them for oil wells. And so this, though, is silica sand is much more expensive. It's much finer and purer. And so it's used for these special purposes, whereas construction grade materials use less expensive, rougher sand for, and that serves its purpose. And it's completely good for its purpose. But another recent surge in demand comes from the fracking industry, because silica sand is used for the fracking industry, which Jorden will be telling us a lot more about and now and maybe future episodes. And another thing that's also a big growth industry is also silicon chips. And so this is tech devices, and we have a big growing market for technological devices and other things like glass products and construction and labs. And so it makes this great lightweight glazing. And so because of this, silica market is certainly smaller at just 12.6 billion versus the 112 billion for the construction sand market. But in the next 10 years, it's expected to double in demand. So that's a huge, now we're seeing that, okay, right now, silica sand, maybe not such a big, area for concern, but certainly the direction we're heading is like, okay, we need to start thinking sustainably about this now even.
And I know this is more your area, but when thinking of silica, because of that high quality nature of the resource, there's a lot less regions around the world where it can be produced. And so I think that also has some interesting geopolitical implications when you look at the main production region is Southeast Asia. But not a lot of people know Russia actually has large deposits of high quality silica, which is when we're looking at applying sanctions or other conflicts around the world, that becomes a consideration as we haven't put them on those resources. And I think that there's some interesting tension there that is kind of separate from the larger sand issue.
And I think, that's one of the big issues we regularly confront with anything sustainability is how do we implement international laws that are actually meaningful and carry any weight? Because trying to say, okay, well, we're going to do something about, make sure that we don't run out of sand. How are we going to possibly do this when Russia is off doing its own thing?
Oh, and that's something that actually kind of blew my mind as I was looking into this is 80% of the world's mineral exploration is for more sand resources. And it is one of the least regulated minerals on the planet. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but just on some of the data aspects, I was looking at a United Nations Environmental Program report on top 10 recommendations for how to improve sand. And 3 of them are just start tracking and start understanding sand, because we don't even have the data background to be able to apply some international frameworks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And part of this is just due to the fact of the huge construction boom in Asia and just the exponential growth that has happened in China and is happening in India and various Southeast Asia, all of those emerging economies that then now suddenly are like, wow, we need more buildings. It's especially the commercial aspects. We need more industry and so forth. But also we still see demand in the United States and North America, Canada, and also Mexico, another emerging economy, right? So North America as well as Europe. And a lot of that actually comes from housing and commercial buildings too. So it's not about the sort of infrastructure that China and India and those other emerging economies need to put in place. It's about, hey, we need to build more buildings just for more business and more people.
Yeah, and I think most people would be surprised to know that when you add this all up, around 8 to 9% of global CO2 emissions come from the manufacturing and processing of cement and concrete. It is a major driver.
And that is huge, because that's something like you just don't really think about, right? As we talked about, as I read in the intro, that's something that when people probably don't know sand is the second most in-demand resource on the planet. But we sort of take for granted the fact that, oh, well, you can go and buy concrete mix, or you can go, and it's just there. We don't necessarily think about sand as being a main component of that, or sand being a main component in microchips.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The use cases for it, I think, are actually amazing, and it speaks to like the amazing things we can do. And even in some of the things we'll get into later on alternatives, it's really taking like, how can we take this material that we've used in 100 ways and find the 101st way to use it, right?
And so the problem is that, I mean, it's great because everyone likes to think technology is what's going to save us, right? And if you've listened to the podcast, you know Michael's always shouting, "Oh yes, technology will save us, or we'll just kill us," right? But I mean, this is one of those things where and Jorden, I know Jorden is way more optimistic about the future too, and the purposes for technology and saving us than I am. I'm the big skeptic, although I've always been very much an idealist, and so I'm not sure how that all meshes out in my life. But the thing is that when it comes to sand, is that this extraction and this demand is really rough on the environment. It destroys habitat. It displaces marine life. It suffocates plants when the sand is dredged up. I mean, basically, what's happening? Some people don't even really understand, like, are unaware. Like, people in the middle of the night will get a dump truck and will get a backhoe and go and just start digging sand out around bridges and around seabeds and stuff, like in the middle of the night. And they do this, and the next thing, people wake up and the bridge collapses 5 days later, and nobody really knows why, because this all happened on the sly, right? And so in the process of doing that, it's putting all of these effluents in the water, and it's suffocating the plants when the sand is dredged up, and all the sediment gets stirred up. It blocks the sunlight. It exacerbates coastline erosion. It causes water pollution, and this leads to salination of fresh water supplies. So all of this, just the dredging. But then we also have the mining side of it, because some of this sand is mined. And that's super destructive too. I mean, most people are really aware of the problems with mining, associated with mining. And I mean, we'll do a whole episode on mining because it's worthy of that. But it causes a similar variety of problems as the sand dredging does. And so we definitely see that this affects local communities. It destroys the local ecosystems. It also causes just a battery of health problems for people, the obvious ones that come with mining and refining, like lung problems. But the extraction and refining also causes issues like pollution for locals, loss of food supply, water contamination, like all of those things that they're used to having. And I mean, just even like, as we talked about in the last episode, climate anxiety for people who are living around just really ugly landscapes that have just become desolate. And so all of these things, like, so we've got this, and then sand removal also facilitates malaria breeding sites. So yeah, just what we need, more malaria, right? And then it's also in various places in Africa connected to Buruli ulcer disease. And so all of these things that we just sort of take for granted, that, oh, you want to go, build a little, I don't know, outbuilding, just go get some concrete, just throw it down, right? These are things that we don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, and I think I always like stories to kind of illustrate the point for me. It solidifies it. And I found one that I think illustrates the short-term kind of drivers of this and the long-term consequences. So when we look at Kerala as a region in India that's known for its river systems and its beautiful estuaries, over the last 20 years, one of their large major rivers, the Manimala River, it disappeared completely because of sand mining. And this is a process, people knew it was going on for a long time. And there's a great 2017 Times article called How to Steal a River. I'll make sure we get that in the show notes. I recommend everybody read it. And they really talked about the short-term pressures where, for a worker in this community, could make 200 rupees a day working at a bank job, but he could make 2,000 rupees a night dredging sand with a buddy on a boat, diving down and pulling up baskets of sand. And similarly, the homeowners along the river were charging, like, the criminal organizations who run the trucks, they were charging them like 150 rupees per truckload. Yeah, you can come take sand, load it up. That river is now not a river anymore. It's a completely dry bed because the sand actually acted as a way of holding back some of that monsoon rain and absorbing it. It acted as a giant sponge that kept the river active. So now those same homeowners who were once getting 150 rupees per truckload are paying 1,500 rupees roughly for trucks of water to be brought in that they don't have anymore. And I think that it just really illustrated for me the short-term pressure to, to make money, to build houses in your region, and then the long-term consequences of not, there was never one basket of sand that led to that river going, but each basket you did drove them closer and closer. And then just on the environmental damage, I think it's actually a lot worse than it sounds when you just list it off. Because when you talk about the coastline erosion, wetlands, estuaries, these are some of the most fragile and important ecosystems we have. And so it's like one of my favorite areas is actually, sorry, ecological economics, and looking at what are some of the human systems and value if we actually had to pay for the services that ecosystems are providing. Not taken into consideration very often. But when you start looking at wetlands, when you start looking at deltas, and for the flood mitigation, wildlife, and what's called water purification, all of these services that are provided from them aren't being accounted for and are being lost, because the thing we can account for is how much can you get paid for that basket of sand.
And that's exactly what cost externalities mean when we're talking, not saying that, okay, you can pay for this basket of sand, but it does not begin to reflect the actual price and cost of what's being paid. And we don't necessarily, like with your story about what happened with Kerala and the river, is that that's not something you see happening before your eyes necessarily. It's this depletion that happens slowly over time. And the fact of the matter is that 132 countries in the world and another 32 that are emerging economies are all countries where people, many people, are trying to just figure out how they're going to get to their, pay their medical bills or get where their next income is, because a lot of these are people who work in the informal sector and don't even get a paycheck, right? And those who do, they're just looking to, like, how am I going to improve the quality of my life for me and my family and raise us up to a decent level of standard of living. And then on top of that, these are people who also have cell phones, where some of this demand for this technology is coming from. And they might not be the 5G and so forth. Some of them still have flip phones, but they've got them and they have more information about what's going on in the world than ever before. And so they see how people live in other parts of the world. It's in their face in a way that never was before. And so it's completely understandable why, if I were in that position, I'd probably do the same thing. And then just deal with, and you know what, you could die from tsetse, disease, like get bitten by a tsetse fly and die from dengue or fever or whatever between now and then. So maybe you don't even care because you don't have the luxury to be able to afford to care. And so this illegal sourcing is really problematic, especially in developing countries, because we've seen regular bridge collapses, but it's not even just limited to that. I mean, this has happened in Portugal. This has happened in Taiwan. And if we separate out Taiwan and Hong Kong and Macau, when we talk about China, all three of those would be global North developed countries. So Taiwan is basically, like we're talking about Canada, US, the economy on par with, choose a European country, right? And so the standard of living is great. And yet we still see these same things happening in these places too. It's really astounding to read all of the places in the world to see where this happens and what the implications are for this illegal dredging. And corruption is a big problem.
Yeah, and I think the size of it is what is really like almost mind-boggling. I think just one way of illustrating this is, so Singapore has grown 20% since the 60s, and that's all been through bringing sand in to build out land. And it's actually got to the point where a lot of countries have banned exports of sand in the region to Singapore as a way to curb it. And so I was just looking at this. So if you look, Cambodia, if you look at Cambodia export data, they have only exported $5 million USD worth of sand in the last 10 years to Singapore. If you look at Singapore import data, they have imported 752 million USD of sand from Cambodia. So that gap between the legal and the illegal sand industry in just one country is around $745 million USD. And then, just another way is if you look at Indonesia, 24 islands have already disappeared in Indonesia, with 80 more threatened from illegal mining, with no idea. And we can only track this through like geospatial imaging. And I think that it's just, two small anecdotes, but really drive at how large of an illegal industry this is. And just, speaking of India again, actually sand, the illegal mining and sale of sand is India's largest organized criminal activity.
Wow, I did not know that. But it is knowing what I know now about sand, especially after following up for this episode, it is not hard for me to believe that. And and we see these, in Indonesia, islands disappearing. Meanwhile, not far off in the South China Sea, there we've got China building up what used to just be rocks, and now they're whole they're not bases, but yeah.
What's an
Yeah,
airstrip in the middle of the South China
yeah, that's right. Yes. We're just bringing in more tourists. That's all. And so we also see the same thing happening like in Dubai. I mean, come on, do we really need anything else going on in Dubai that's going to undermine the environment? Like, let's build an entire palm tree complex of sand, beaches or islands off of the coast there, and all of the hotels are 100% top notch, eco friendly, sustainable, and yet the just sort of glosses over the fact that they had to build these islands using sand in the first place.
And to the point that we made about how desert sand isn't applicable for this, you look at the Burj Khalifa, the world's largest building, on the edge of a desert with sand all around it, and all of the sand for that project was imported from Australia. So it just really, I think, drives home almost there's a level of silliness with some of this, right?
And that, I mean, that goes to the source of the demand. Wait, where is this demand coming from? A lot of the demand is coming from Asia, because there are so many emerging economies. We've got East Asian countries, and we've got, I mean, obviously China, and we've got India, but we've also got a lot of emerging economies in Southeast Asia. And one thing that they share is they all have a lot of coastline, or they're islands, right? And so then they have to worry about island depletion and erosion as well. And so meanwhile, they're just got these like burgeoning economies, and they need the infrastructure and they need the commercial properties. And so 47% of the demand in 2023 for construction sand was just in Asia alone. And to be fair, yeah, these are countries where, if we talk about where growth needs to happen, these are countries that need more infrastructure, unquestionably. And we probably don't need a whole lot more new houses in North America. And yet we'd still see a lot of buildings going up that use way more concrete for much bigger houses than we really need. And you can find that in a previous episode if you want to know more about sustainable housing. And so I thought was really fascinating piece of info I came across, though, is that a 2015 report by the Washington Post, and it's a whole trail of names and calculations based on a U.S. Geological Survey, noted that in 3 years, between 2011 and 2013, China used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. I blew that because, man, I wanted to say that, right? So China used more cement than the US did in the entire 20th century in 3 years' time. It's because of its mass infrastructure and development projects. And so this is something where we see that this needs to happen. And yet this, especially where we see this demand in developing countries, the likelihood that this is going to happen in a sustainable way is far less than it will be where we see the demand in North America and Europe, who follow in terms of overall demand for construction sand. That's much more likely to happen sustainably. And yet that's, just a fraction of where the rest of the demand is likely to come from.
Yeah, and I do think on the kind of emerging markets, I do think that as they reach a certain level of development, I'm thinking China here, there can be a cost pressure that can drive over. So like because the price of sand is going up, and even in the illegal markets, we're seeing those cost pressures again, because the point where you're taking out as much as we're taking out, and the how dispersed you have to get it, that's going to drive up costs. So I do see some, I guess, hope on that side, that as the cost comes down for alternatives and the price in sand goes up, that hopefully we can see that as a driver for change in some of the global south.
Yes, and that's it. Like we need to find our little glimmers of hope where we can, right? When we talk about sustainability issues. But no, I agree, and I think that I did an interview recently with Joe Zamet-Lucia, which you hopefully have already listened to, and he talks about, a lot of that interview was about how it's about progress and making progress. And we're all sort of in a long game, whether we want to be or not, just because of the various factors that we have to consider. And governments can't make change overnight. Businesses can't make change overnight, right? And that's exactly what Jorden was just talking about here, that yeah, when it comes to sand, that we will see, and we'll talk about some of the alternatives and strategies that companies and governments are trying to put into place to address the fact that sand has actually been added to the list of conflict goods. And if you're not familiar with what conflict goods are, these are basically anything that fund subversive groups or crime organizations. And so most people think like blood diamonds, or like, I don't know. I know so many of them that I can't off the top of my
head. Ivory.
Yeah, yes, ivory, right, of course. And so, but there are others. Like I even read about strawberries as conflict good. Yeah. And so these conflict goods are anything that can basically fund a tyrannical government or some sort of terrorist organization or anybody who can control that resource, right? And sand is one of those. With all of this illegal activity that's going on, this is being used to support rebel faction groups in West Africa.
Well, there have been hundreds of known killings over sand in the last 3 years, right? And I stress the known because at the point that it's being reported on, there's a lot more that's happening that's not getting covered. And I'm thinking more at the state actor level. North Korea recently has been entering deals with China to export more sand, and South Korea is actually looking at importing sand from North Korea. So it is such a big part of our world that I think that when countries start feeling pressure for it as a resource, other considerations get dropped by, which is one of the reasons I think that you see this proliferation of an illegal industry. Back to that Cambodia example, you're not, exporting $700 million a year without government officials knowing about that along that chain, right?
And we'll talk about other resources, minerals, and so forth, like gold. There's a whole underground gold market where exactly the same with Cambodia. Like this legitimate amount leaves the country, but here's what's actually going on the records and the recipient end because they don't want to be caught, cheating. But where is that whole big gap and who's around to enforce that and actually, we just don't have the resources internationally to be able to monitor all of all this transnational crime that's going on. And another one is just mind blowing, but make sure that you just don't buy concrete mix from some guy off of some corner, right? Who's looking dodgy, because there is such thing as counterfeit concrete mix. This is a huge problem, and it's a common transnational crime activity that goes on a lot in Latin America. And I'm familiar with the Latin American examples. I know that happens everywhere around the world, though, and it causes all sorts of structural issues with buildings, and it's goes along with the fact that there's already a lot of corruption. Right, countries are rife with corruption. They have lax building codes and lax building code enforcement. And in fact, it's actually being deemed to be one of the causes of the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh in 2013. It was like where 1,000 people were killed in the garment industry workers. And it was just horrendous. And we talked a little bit about this in fast fashion, a previous episode, because this was just like this horrendous building collapse. And 3 days later, people had forgotten about it. But
so I was just going to say, it's actually a big thing in Canada because one of our main chains, Superstore, it owns a clothing line, Joe Fresh, and that was where they sourced all of it from that factory. So, and it's funny, this is the Rana Plaza incident has followed me throughout my sustainability career from so many different angles. So, and I didn't know about the sand lens. So when I saw that as a note there, it just pinged this decade-long, this incident I think will come up in another 15 different ways.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things on the structural issue is as we've expanded more into marine dredging, like out of fresh water and into salt water, if the sand that's brought up from ocean isn't processed right and there's a high enough concentration of saline still in it, that can lead to those structural problems in 10 years. And it's such an insidious problem because if you're, trusting the stamp on it and it's moving through a corrupt process, there's no way to know when you're mixing it, when you're making that building, until 10 years down the line when it starts crumbling and breaking apart in ways that it shouldn't based on what you thought you were buying.
So some of the problem can be in the processing itself, but some of it is just in the fact that they're like cutting in other stuff just to spread, like they do with cocaine, right? It's just crazy. And I mean, it's like, yeah, okay, so maybe people buying cocaine should think twice about that. Anyway, I don't know. Like so many things have changed with the drug laws these days. I don't even know. Like just to think, no, LSD bad, but now apparently microdosing in LSD is an acceptable thing. I don't really follow this.
No, I mean, but like, who would have thought when we started a sand episode that we'd be talking about cutting sand, sand mafias across the globe, right? And I do think it is an example of why every sustainability issue is actually a lot more exciting than you think of when you're just like, hey, we're going to talk about sand today.
So, so, so we've all of this that we've talked about so far have just been about construction sand. We also need to get to the silica sand part because that's also right part of what's going on here. And because this process is definitely more highly regulated because it's so much purer, right? And it hasn't caused the same extraction. You can't just go and dredge it up in the same way that you can with the construction sand. And because it has to meet much more rigorous standards, you're not likely to have it cut with something else, right? But the problem with this is there are limited high purity deposits. And refining it is really, really energy intensive. So that adds to carbon emissions. That creates far more carbon emissions than the processing of the construction sand. And it's mining, like as we talked about, is a really nasty business. So even though it's different sand and it's not typically sourced illegally, the industry really needs to get moving on implementing these sustainability practices because, as I mentioned earlier on, the demand for this is doubling like in the next not even 10 years. So that's a huge issue. But one of the ways that businesses and so forth have been trying to at least try to curb and address some of these illegal issues is toward digitizing the supply chain. And this is obviously getting a lot easier as we have GPS and we have these radio, active monitor type things. And so both for the efficiency, but this is also a strategy to better monitor real-time extraction and transport and shipping distribution. And so when it comes to sustainability, this is something, certainly one factor that's really going to help us help business and governments move in that direction of keeping track of where it's sourced. Is it a legitimate source? Is it somewhere being along the line being tampered with? And is it going to degrade in a way that it really shouldn't? And things like with the saline where that's not even something where you can't tell at the time, right? You just have to trust, like Jorden said, you have to trust the process and trust that it's been stamped and it's actually legitimate. And so there are a lot of different sustainability strategies. And so I know decarbonizing is something that Jordan's really, really keen on. So I'm going to let him talk about that.
Yeah, so I want to separate here, as we did earlier, concrete and silica. So I'll start with concrete because I actually think while more things would need to be put in place, there's some straightforward options on decarbonizing construction concrete. And I think like at the top, the basic one is actually just changing how we design buildings. And so that's a big one. Like, as you noted in a great episode of the pod on housing, how we're building and how we're designing is kind of really like exploded, honestly, in terms of size and stuff. But also then looking at like things of how our fire code in North America is different than fire codes in Europe, which require larger buildings with 2 staircases, for fire access. So just like little things that most people would never even think of and would honestly be weird to walk into a new type of building can go a long way in dropping off, that first kind of 10 to 20% of demand and taking it away. So I think, and that's already starting in the kind of architecture space and trying it out. But this is almost an easy way for governments to get in, right? I think that in terms of decarbonizing concrete, governments have actually been a barrier to this. So basically in terms of building codes, but then also just I know of examples where cement companies are trying to make low carbon cement and put it out into new applications, and they're getting blocked from municipalities for using them as paving stones, not structural, not anything. When we can drop what's called the CO2 intensity of this slab by 40%, but they won't let them put them in. So I think that like right there, when we're talking at the top level, governments using their procurement power to try to drive demand for decarbonized cement, but then also just approving applications where we can use this goes a long way to kind of starting it. And so then from there, just really thinking of like the kind of the hard part, right? So when we look at it, 80% of the CO2 from concrete comes from, 82 comes from the cement. So it's the process of turning limestone into clinker. And really, when you look at that, it's about 40% of that from fossil fuel heat, and then 60% from chemical reactions in limestone. So when we're, and I keep having to break this down because when we talk about it, we'll split it off. So think of the limestone. There's some really great examples of companies already using fly ash or iron slag, other industrial waste processes that you can build into a stream and not have to use the limestone. So you can start cutting down some of the emissions right there, just in the reaction phase. But again, we're into the point of they have differences in the final product. So I think one of the hard things as we talk about this is right now we have this wonderful product, right? That can basically use one of three kind of common mixes. You know how it's going to work, you know the properties, we've seen it for 60, 70 years. And with big buildings, people get understandably nervous about how is this going to work out over the long run. And so as we're looking at substituting in fly ash or iron slag, or at the aggregate level, recycled glass, these have all been shown to work in the concrete industry and reduce the CO2 intensity, but they would all have to be used in different applications. And you have to consider different things, which makes it more complex for a business. Just from even on the manufacturing side, you're going from one manufacturing stream, limestone, reacting into clinker, into cement, to now looking at potentially either switching out your factory. So you're only using like iron slag on Mondays and Tuesdays and fly ash, right? Or building multiple processes. So I think that that's some of the reason why, even though we have some of these great examples I can point to right away that would reduce the CO2, why aren't we seeing it is always my next question, right? I think it's great to be excited about technology. I always am, and I'll try to hit the bingo card of technology will get us for those who are counting. But I think that the next step after that is, well, why aren't we seeing it then? And you hit in those business processes, right? And the complexities there. On the other side, I mentioned that 40% of the CO2 for cement comes from just the fossil fuel, like burning it to produce that reaction. Right away, 40 to about 50% of that heat's lost through leakage. So just redesigning our kilns and upgrading from kind of the last, 50-year kind of model to the next one can either recapture a lot of that waste heat or look at some, thermocoupling options to turn that waste heat into electricity to go back into the system. So these are, top four kind of solutions at the start. I think we have, and we need to start finding ways to incentivize businesses to invest in them. And that goes back to my point about government using its procurement power to kind of drive demand and put up contracts for it. When we look at silica, it's actually a little harder because there's in the concrete process, there's things we can sub in, there's other options. One I forgot to mention that I have to mention is that's really cool is there are firms that are taking CO2 streams that have been captured from industrial processes and actually putting that into seawater or a groundwater brine and creating a reaction to produce a solid rock aggregate. So taking a waste CO2 stream and turning it back into, and when you can, or injecting CO2 into concrete as a curing agent. And what that does is gets you to about 4 to 5% of the volume of stored CO2 in a long-term durable 100+ year storage. So there's some really interesting ways that we can actually look at concrete as a carbon sink. So like right now, it's a carbon debt, right? Like in the way we do it. And I think that as we look forward to some of these solutions, you can start to look at this massive amount of building material as a carbon sink. And that changes the calculation. Silica, the main CO2 from the process is in the heat. So it is a high heat industrial process. It's stationary and as you noted, like a lot less supply around the world. So you're looking at fewer locations, but it's a similar problem that we're seeing across steel, silica, other industrial processes that require at this point fossil fuels to do. So one of the main, when you're looking at silica, one of the main ways to reduce the CO2 intensity there is looking at some future hydrogen streams. And there's a lot of issues with will that come online actually, and will see those emission reductions. So where I think that we're actually going, and this is looking at alternative substances, is where we're going to have to go for silica.
And I think that there are a number of things worth remarking on that you mentioned about this. Is one is that we, it is not really super simple just to redesign a business model, actual physical way that the process works, to suddenly just say, oh, well, we're going to use slag one day and we're going to use less, right? That's not how it works. And so businesses have to end up investing a lot of money. I was just talking about recycling recently. And when it comes to recycling, it's like, well, why doesn't a recycling center take certain plastics or certain items or not? The fact is if we just look at the actual facility where this happens, they'd have to put in an entire different conveyor belt just for that, to push that product off one place, and they have to have an aftermarket for it. So it seems like from what you've described, there's certainly an aftermarket for a lot of this waste from other industries that could actually be used in this process to really help make it much more efficient and sustainable. But there, in addition to the actual physical process of changing this up, then we've got the government interference. And then on top of that, then there's also the fact that the recycling itself is a great thing, right? Because concrete, like, you don't really think of that, oh, well, I'll just throw the concrete that I have, just got, my wall fell down, I'm going to just throw that in my recycle bin and it's going to go out with my weekly recycling, right? That is not how concrete recycling works. And major cities seem to have recycling depots for concrete. I know Cincinnati has a few places. It's a really cheap process to recycle. You might see signs where people want clean fill. I mean, that's the same basic thing. And it's really important to try to keep that out of the landfills, because it takes up a lot of space in landfills. And landfills, it's like, that's a really expensive process. We'll spend an entire episode just talking about that whole issue with waste and landfills. But when it's crushed, it can be used for so many things, right? So things that you would be using virgin resources or other, non-renewable resources to make road gravel or retaining walls or landscaping or making new concrete even. And there's a whole process that can separate out the aggregates from the cement paste, and the cement paste and the aggregates can be reused again. And so there are a lot of reasons that we should be finding ways to try to recycle more concrete. And that, along with the fact that we have so many electronic devices and we've got just so much electronic waste in the world, that especially for the silica end of the sand issue, that really trying to help counter demand for silica sand, we need to ramp up recycling programs for old devices to be able to harvest those resources so that we don't have to keep drawing from limited supplies.
No, and I think you mentioned the city level, but we already know this can be done. I think one of the greatest examples at a country level is roughly 45% of all material recycled in Australia is recycled concrete and building material. So I think the pressure there is a little different when you're dealing with an island and landfill space, but I think it goes to illustrate how it can be done. We know it can be done if the incentives are in the right place. Or if you look at the European Union, I believe roughly 10% of all concrete currently used is recycled concrete, right? So it's pushing that scale up. And that's the only other point I want to make, and I think it touches on decarbonizing and recycling, is a big problem here is market power. So when you look at the largest global sand players and add them up, and we're talking even just at the country level, take the biggest kind of players, they control 5 to 7% of the global market. So when you don't have, we usually are talking about the negatives of industrial kind of, what's called consolidation and market power. But I think this is actually the flip side, is when you have a market that is so dispersed and has no one player who can actually make a move, making some of these changes and pushing it through gets really difficult.
And I kind of think of the United States. I don't know what the figures are for the US, but I kind of feel like in the United States, our attitude is like, we've got so much land where we can just dump everything. Like, we could just basically bury the state of Nevada in garbage and concrete and whatever. And nobody's like, okay, 5 Nevadans who live there are going to care. But, and people will be really pissed off if Las Vegas is gone. But otherwise, whatever. So I feel like Americans are especially really irresponsible when it comes to this sort of, as opposed to especially the Europeans. But it's not because they're like, okay, maybe they feel better than, Americans or North Americans for that matter. But it's good. They've got a lot more limited land. So they have to, they have that incentive built in. And so when it comes to things like adaptive reuse of buildings, that's another thing too, right? Repurposing structures for a different use rather than just demolishing. That way you don't need any new concrete at all, or maybe not a bit, but and this differs from retrofitting, and both can make buildings far more sustainable. And we talked about this in an earlier episode too, with sustainable buildings and cities, and especially for older buildings. This is like Marks and Spencer, if anybody's familiar with the Brits, right? Marks and Spencer is in a battle with the government to demolish its original 1930s building, and it makes me go, oh my gosh, why would they want to do this, right? They want to build a new one. And they were approved to build a new one. And then like this public concern came up and they countered it. Now the government has ruled against them and there's like the stay. And so it's still to be determined what's actually going to happen. But reusing these buildings is one way that it's a lot easier just to do that than just raising them. And I always think of I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, we've got shopping malls that are just like ghost towns nowadays. Right. And it's like they don't even like by where I grew up, there's like they have one store and an anchor store and the rest of the entire mall that was like this thriving place where teenagers went. It was the coolest place to go. Right. You go to the movies and go to the arcade and whatever and buy shoes. And then the whole parking lot around that. And it's just like gone, like nothing. It's just sitting there. Right. And so repurposing is like would save us so much. And so we have also all sorts of alternatives, and Jorden talked about some of the different alternatives for concrete and construction sand and silica. Do you have more?
Yeah, so I got one I really want to talk about on the concrete side because it gets to the deserts, and I want to bring those back in for a second. So there's multiple streams that we're seeing of teams of researchers and companies working on how can we use desert sand. Because as we mentioned at the top, while there is no natural replenishment rate for sand in a human lifetime. It is thousands of years, the replenishment rate. And so when we're looking at where can we take this from, deserts do offer, I think, a good alternative. Now, as you noted, you can't use it. It's smooth. It's wind-worn versus what you see in water. So there's a team out of Britain that's been looking at how to turn desert sand into a concrete substitute for certain applications. So I think that it's really clear. On all of these alternatives, we have to be clear on what they can and can't be used for. So the team out of Britain is looking at how to make a compressible substance that can be replaced in some of the non-structural uses of concrete. But the one that I'm really excited about is a team of German researchers at the Concrete Studies Institute, which I love academics. And they've actually looked at a thermal process for basically cracking desert sand and producing a rough grain sand that can just slot right into the aggregate process. The big problem there is, and it's similar to a lot of sustainability issues, is it's a better product. It has less impact. The amount of energy required to do it is astronomical.
It's the same with desalination, right? It's the same sort of thing where you look at we can have more water out of salt water, but look at the implications of that. And when we look at the bigger picture, which is to try to make sure that we reduce greenhouse gas carbon emissions, then we're really in trouble, because the last thing we want to do is start having more energy intensive activities going on, right? And
until we replace the energy source with low carbon sources, I really do believe energy is kind of our bottleneck on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, and I know we will get to energy. Jorden has a lot to say about that, and we'll probably need about 4 episodes probably to do that justice.
Yeah, and then on the silica side, this is really interesting to me because the drive for replacing silica is actually not coming from a sustainability lens. It's there, but we're actually running into some physical limitations in our computer architecture from silica. I mean, a lot of people, I have a 14-year-old nephew, and I love kind of telling him things that blow his mind. And one of them is that, like, finding silica and how we can use this in computers took us from glass vacuum tubes, right, to the actual world we live in now. And when, a lot of people who are familiar with this space will know Moore's law and the doubling of computer power. We're reaching the kind of edge of what you can do there with silica for that. So there's actually a bunch of options that are being looked at, from gallium nitride to silicon carbide or graphene, to replace silica. Now, across all 3 of those options, they all work. They've all been able to kind of replace it and have better properties so we can push new computer architecture. They're all running into the scaling of production challenge.
And that's the thing. Well, my question always too is, okay, so, now we can use desert sand or we can use coal-based graphene or whatever, but then we're also going to be tapping those like to the nth degree too, right? We're going to be like, then what happens was, so we just keep sort of, I feel like in some ways we never really solve problems. We just create new problems and sort of move along to the next thing, right? But
and that's why it's a wicked problem, right?
And yet you feel we should be hopeful, right? Like you mentioned, governments, there are some things that governments are doing. There are things governments could be doing more of. There are some really encouraging things that corporations are doing. Some countries have banned the sand dredging and like the same, like we're not going to export more sand to Singapore so they can just keep expanding, those sorts of things. Companies are integrating technologies to better the trace sourcing and the tracking of the shipping and help to at least try to ameliorate some of the illegal dredging, right? And then we've got the technology to the rescue, right? Everybody hopes technology might save the day with synthetic alternatives, but until then, I don't know. Jorden, I know you're hopeful because I think you're always going to be more hopeful than me.
So it's funny, you said you're naturally an idealist who's a little pessimistic. I'm naturally a pessimist who's eternally optimistic about this. It's a weird balance. No, I am hopeful, and I think it goes back to when I think about these issues, I always like to look at like where's the low-hanging fruit and how much of a reduction or benefit could we get from those kind of activities. And so in the sand space specifically and looking at the construction side of things, going back to, like I said, using waste products that we already have from other industries and have proven to flow in. And those are a lot easier to set up from a business standpoint. Also, because one business is like, hey, we'll buy your waste really cheaply and you get to sell your waste for something. There's a lot of incentives for both sides to do that. And then looking at the ways that government can actually influence this without needing massive new bills, without needing massive new investments, simply by approving like use cases and then by procurement. So I think when you look at those three kind of waste streams, procurement and use cases, we do have a not inconsequential amount of CO2 that we can reduce from this process and improve the sustainability of it. That's what makes me hopeful.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. So I'm hoping that you're I guess I was kind of hopeful too. So maybe together we'll be very hopeful and see some real progress here made on the sand front. So
we had to have one pun in it,
I mean to do it. It just sort of came out. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let us know. You can just say hi to Jorden too by email here at mail@splanetpod.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these links on our show notes, as definitely the Times article that Jorden mentioned of how to steal a river. We'll make sure that's there. From today's episode, you can read more on my next Substack post. We'd really appreciate it if you'd rate and review, or just rate, please, Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. It only takes a minute. It will really help us out. Thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.